Welcome to Sweet Spot Safari. Here we explore polarities and patterns. Today we're talking about youth and elders, and we have another super guest with us. It's Mark Straw from Community Praxis. Welcome, sir. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. I'm blessed. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you. Looking forward to it. It's a little bit nerve-wracking because, hearing your voice, I know we're kind of sort of used to it, but it always creates a little bit of like, rah, I sound like that. Ah, that's not good. Now I know why people think what they think.
There's that, and obviously the kind of video, the mirror of you kind of being beamed back, which actually I turn off now. So yeah, I hear you. I think it's going to take a long while for us to get used to this and become second nature. But listen, young people and elders, I think this is a really important topic. So how about we start with just a quick snapshot, a glimpse of what you do, Mark, and why you care about this subject. Over to you.
Thank you, Ben. I suppose why I care about this, I think it's all about culture. It's about how I was brought up, about actually what I observed as a child, a lot of pain and trauma and suffering, not just for myself but others around me. I was kind of suppose that initially I was brought up in a very religious, not very religious, but there was a religious part of that as well, which I used to read scripture on a Sunday at a Methodist church when I was a young boy. My grandfather rented a farm in North Derbyshire, and on Sundays everyone go church. And it was, I don't know whether I showed a bit of an interest or something, but I was given the opportunity to read scripture. And I suppose even that level of sort of knowledge kind of made you concerned for others around you, as it were. And that was kind of politicized me from early days, as well as my father's sister married a man from Ghana and 2 children. And that was when you really saw contradiction and inconsistency really raise its head, as it were. We're talking, in the 70s, racist spaces, family really racist. And yet my cousins, who I love dearly, are black. And it's kind of this kind of elephant in the room, which is not really the elephant in the room. It's so bloody massive, yet everyone can see it, that there's inconsistency here. I don't like you, but you're all right. You're all right. You're my, grandchildren, you're all right. But the mothers, well, I don't know about them. And that kind of, led to a place. 82, there was the riots, Toxteth and Brixton and places were that meant, and then I was kind of becoming more engaged in those conversations, even as a young boy. That by the age of 16, I was bought by my cousins the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, and you became really aware of the Anti-Nazi League and music, and young people. You were kind of marchers. Was a member of the African National Congress when the ANC was a terrorist and organization, which actually I got offered a football scholarship in America in about 89, and they wouldn't let me go to America because they said I was a terrorist, as it were. They said I was a member of a terrorist organization. Remember, when we say I was a member of the ANC, I used to sell raffle tickets. That's it. You don't, I don't raffle tickets. I'm a little guy in North Derbyshire, you get me, who's sort of like just doing your bits, as it were, to talk about sanctions and stuff like that, which obviously, and now we're in a place where everyone forget the journey that people have been on in order to get liberation, as it were, and the challenge, as it were, and the loss of life and all of those things which come with, colonialism and sort of like moving beyond colonialism. So all of that informed me, and I then went to college. Late on, I didn't really do that well at school. I didn't enjoy the experience of school. I was aware of, again, the adults who had a lot of power, as in my family, who were very inconsistent and contradictory and communicating. Remember, we were brought up with capital punishment. So you got beat by teachers. I had my pants pulled down in front of the head teacher and whacked my backside, and everyone saw the glasses bouncing up and down on my nose, as it were. you've been exposed to that level of violence, you know. So when you got to a place and through all of that culture, I wanted to help people, man. That was it. I wanted to help people because there's a lot of people who needed help. Community, my father lost his job, so we had to get on his bike, as Tebbit said. Community becomes kind of like impoverished. We weren't upskilled, so we had to move down to Ipswich, as it were, and he got a job in the cement factory down in Ipswich. So it naturally sort of fell into a space for me, much to a lot of challenge and frustration by other people in the family because they see you as a pain in the arse. Actually, I wanted to help people. That was it. And then in that space, Ben, I kind of became a youth and community worker. And for the last 25 years, I've worked in the voluntary sector. I've worked in the statutory sector. I've worked in prisons. I have my own organisation now where I sit on the board of the National Youth Agency. I do facilitate accredited training, non-accredited training. I'm like a consultant, impact evaluation, storytelling, all of these things now, in a way to sort of like raise the profile of young people and their rights. I believe fundamentally in the rights that young people have and the responsibilities that come with informing and empowering young people. And the passion there is about the role of men have in that space of empowerment and sharing, as it were, because I don't think as a lot of men, we realize our potential and we realize our community responsibility and society's responsibility in sharing and actually informing our boys to actually take an active part in decision making and role modeling what society should be looking like.
That's a great place to start these discussions, Mark, and thank you very much for your career history, profile, youth, elder, some of the challenges you've got, which just leads in perfectly to the whole concept of youth and elder, which again, one of the reasons Ben and I are talking about this with you today is to see if we can find some sweet spots and stuff, because it feels as though, for whatever reason, either consciously or subconsciously, that there's a divide forming in society, which has been going on in terms of perception of youth and elder. So it would be useful to sort of get your perceptions now on where things are now, right? And where, just as a sort of really open question, right? You know, where do you see the challenges between youth and elder, you know, historically, you know, but also now, but also where you see the future is as well? I know that's a very large question, but yeah, let's have your views and perspectives of that, okay, Mark.
I think that there's always been, of course, and it has to be, there's a hierarchical thing. So we can't look back and say, oh, there were those halcyon days where equity was kind of riding high and young people were listened to. No, I remember going with my grandfather, going to houses, delivering eggs and milk and that, and you were told to sit down, shut up, and not say a word. I used to sit in a hard chair and not say a word, and you'd have to watch the elders to communicate amongst themselves. And why I say that as a starting point is because I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. I think that there is something there about responsibility and positionality, which actually I learned a lot from. I learned my place and how we can communicate as elders and as young people listening to elders. Because I listened, and I saw respect and manners and value, and I spoke to when I was spoken to, as it were. And it felt okay. I was bored, of course I was. And I was kind of maybe frustrated, but I knew it was at the adult time. And there's a respect in that space that I think maybe is lost through time, because I think that level of hierarchy has been blurred. Now, that suggests then that we're moving into a place where things are more inclusive. And the illusion is they are more inclusive. The illusion is that now we don't have the same barriers, as it were. But I think what we've morphed into is something where it's very difficult to actually recognise who's the elder, who's the younger, we're all in it together, as it were. And I don't think that allows people to build that level of sort of respect, but also kind of like a critical lens in that space for you to actually understand your position. If we go back, obviously, historically, there was always this idea that young people were kind of learning from the families around them. They learned from those families. The families were very active in the education of the children, as it were. what your father did, you probably did, and you spent time with your father learning that trade. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a lot of fathers or not fathers who aren't spending time with their children, as it were. So the boys are having to learn something, or girls, having to learn by observing those around them. And because we live in these communities, some communities are very well financed and there's an aspiration in there, but there's also, as we know, the social mobility and we know the socio-economic sort of situations. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's, you know, it's not a political thing to say. It's a part of our capitalist sort of system, as it were. Then you've got like some communities aren't invested in having those people, those adults around young people to actually have those spaces. No, a lot of young people don't really engage with adults in those spaces, as it were. They don't need to. I think historically there was always a space. Youth services, there was a space. Trusted adult had a space. Young people could drop in and they could build relationships with a trusted adult. They would learn to get feedback and they would learn to be curious and they would learn to test things out with adults, as it were. Youth services disappeared. So we don't have that space anymore for anywhere in our communities, which is voluntary association. We're not talking about, you know, I pay and I go to that place there, because then, of course, there's a hierarchy in that space. So there aren't the same amount of spaces that were available for young people to meet adults and to actually engage and to build some level of sort of responsibility and accountability to each other. So what happens when we don't have that space, of course, we just drift. And we're now we've got a saturation of, in a way, really negative youth subculture. The way in which music is positioned, the way in which entertainment is positioned, it's investing in really kind of like a narcissistic, Epicurean type of like pleasures. It's all about self. It's not about anybody else, as it were. So young people are getting this narcissistic idea that it's all about them. So they can access the porn, they can access this, they want the Louis Vuitton, they want all of these things, which obviously, you know, a lot of money.
I see. So what you're saying is that because there's that void that we've created, because the fathers particularly, or the parents generally, have not been there, is that people are turning to social media, they're turning to other areas, and it's all about trinkets, isn't it? And it's interesting what you were saying about the narcissistic side. I'd never really thought about that, Epicurean, is that, you know, I have observed influencers, for instance, now, and the great conundrum is that we didn't used to take, in the old days, we used to take photographs of the Parthenon, right, or the Great Baths in Rome and this, that, and the other. That is almost now irrelevant. It's just, I'm there and it's me. It's about me. I just happen to be there, rather than it being about the beauty of those wonderful buildings or the seascapes or the landscapes or anything else. So, yeah, that's really interesting to see how this has evolved.
I think that's our challenge, is that it's all about me. So we don't see I or we just see I. We don't see a we no more. There's no kind of responsibility to other people. You know, we live in this idea, we've been reduced and reduced and reduced. So we're now just reduced to ourselves, as it were. Ourselves in our bedrooms with our headsets on. You know, and that's how we kind of expected to live our life now. You know, we can go into the metaverse and we can sort of live in that space, as it were, which is a bizarre thing that we have sort of all embraced, and we all think that's acceptable, that actually that we can live on our ones, even though as a human being, we're part of a wider family. We're connected as human beings, as a species. And in that connection, we kind of connect with each other. We're supposed to be so connected, and yet so many people are lonely. That's young people as well. Young people, they've got 15 years of their life and they're really lonely. They're suffering really kind of challenging mental health and well-being issues. Believe that. And there's an absence in there about a feeling of belonging, or a feeling of love, or a feeling of having a voice, as it were. So the question is, why? What have we done from the past? What have we not learned from the past, which is carrying us into this space now? Young people, and I think they used to say, young people in Britain have worse outcomes than other people in Europe even. Mad. So there's got to be something as adults, as parents, that we're not kind of been attentive to. We can't be blaming young people. We've gone through a culture of all blaming young people. They're the pain in the arse. They're the antisocial ones. They're the ones who are always sort of, challenging the process and the systems, which are frustrating to us older people in the community. Well, I think we need to look at ourselves and look at the conditions that we've created, which is now young people are living out. And young people are living out quite a solitary experience, really and truly. So for me, we've got to create spaces. We've got to actually wake people up. We've got to stop anaesthetising people, and we need to get more energy in our communities whereby people can actually we're scared to be vulnerable. Everyone's scared to be vulnerable, because I think we've said that you have with us without us, and life is kind of like, oh my gosh, maybe I say the wrong thing. Maybe I say the wrong thing. Oh shit, I won't say a word. I won't say a word. We need people to be free. We need people to actually express themselves. We need diversity to prevail, and everyone see the contributions all of us make to the whole, as it were. And I think young people, again, are being educated, or should I use the word conditioned, that they're going to actually be part of this kind of like reductionist idea, and it's just about me. Just think about me.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when you touched on diversity then, and of course diversity is one of these things that is being pushed, isn't it, as part of an agenda, shall we say? You look at all the corporations, right? Arguably with good intent, there's no doubt. Nobody ever questions the intent, but it's the execution. Really it should be, one, arguably pull, and two, but also people need to be shown to do it. They need to be experiment. The thing about diversity is you have to experiment. You have to go and work with people. I've worked all over the world, with all sort of races, colours, creeds, you name it. I absolutely love it. And I absolutely support that diversity. But it happens through osmosis. It happens through relationships. It happens through, building and mutual respect, accepting the fact that you're going to work together on a project, right? And you both want, the positive outcome, and stuff, not being told to do it. Because as you say, and it really is that when people are told to do things these days because they're afraid of doing something, the wrong thing, is they're not going to experiment, right? Which I think is a really a powerful point on this. So Ben, please come in on this. You've been
yeah. Well, I think there's a few things which Mark you brought up, which maybe I'll come back to a bit later on. But there is. I think we're all a product of our conditions, aren't we? Young and old, and so I think you've painted a picture of the challenges facing young people. But I guess seeing the other side of the fence, if we actually want to, see it as a fence where actually there's two different sides. But for the purpose of exploring the other part of this, we've also got a lot of older people being written off in the workplace. We've also got the kind of huge amount of technological changes happening in society, which are in many ways kind of excluding older generations as well. And so younger generations are more naturally, having grown up with this technology, more kind of comfortable. It feels just more intuitive. And so I think we kind of almost have the worst of both worlds in many ways at the moment. So I think that there's kind of tropes and unhelpful ways that we kind of describe maybe kind of snowflakes for younger people or greedy boomers. That actually, we're all, nobody has chosen this kind of world which we've grown up in and living in right now. And so then I think about the kind of COVID and its response, and usually a crisis is a good way to reveal how we treat people. And very early on, it didn't look good if you were an old person during COVID. And then also you look at young people now having lost out on socializing, school closures, increased mental health problems, increased loneliness. So at both ends of the scale, if you're young and old, we seem to be creating a society and adapting to different events, which actually harms both young and old people, and I'm trying to get my head around that. And I think you painted a great picture of young people. And obviously, I'm probably classically middle-aged, so I'm kind of sitting in the middle and seeing kind of real challenges for young people all around me, really pretty clear. But also, I'm seeing challenges for getting old and heading towards retirement and having purpose in life. And so, yeah, what's your perspective on how we've managed to kind of create a society which doesn't look after young or old people?
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? As you get old, I mean, this is where you call this podcast elders, and there's a connotation with that of wisdom. And that's so for me it's a bless that we're in this space and we can discuss what we're discussing, because the label on the tin here is something respectful. It's something respectful, and it's something that's mannered, and it's something informed by wisdom, as it were. And I don't get in wider society older people are seen as wise. It's seen maybe they don't have much to contribute to the, and I said that second time, capitalist, because unfortunately we've monetized everything. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I don't know. I'm not the brain of the Britain. But I do wonder about how we create countries, visions away from this materialist sort of like necessity. I was doing some work this morning at a football club with young boys around what success means. I say young boys, that's kind of slightly rude. They're 17, about what success means, as it were. And they all obviously attach money to that success. And then when you strip that back, it's attachments to that success. We need attachments, as it were. So it's maybe, when you're older, then we don't have the same sort of like, people don't perceive that you have the same sort of appetite to make finance and get attachments. Thus, obviously, you're not worthwhile investing in or promoting or presenting as something that actually can make a positive contribution into the lives of others. And of course, we should be putting in systems and processes whereby those elders who have got a wealth of experience and resilience and knowledge about how we navigate life, how we overcome challenge in life, how we communicate, how we reconcile our differences. Because everyone's got lived experience. This was conversation about lived experience. We love lived experience. So there you've got older people, elders in the community with lived experience who have. I remember an experience I had years and years ago. We had to look after. We didn't have to. We looked after an old aunt. Her husband had died, and she was come live with us. And she was an old lady. And I remember I was a young man. I'd come down the stairs on a Sunday after probably been out partying until 3, 4 in the morning, 11 o'clock. She looked at me and said, "You young people think you invented sex?" Always remember that. And it never occurred to me that, wow, is this lady about 94 that she had sex before? I never thought that, and then all of a sudden you saw something and think, oh, yeah, sorry. These people have lived. These people have experienced everything. These people have done everything. So why aren't we equipping our younger people to have better connections? So then the younger people will learn, and they'll learn to appreciate, and they'll actually start to. We talk about cohesive communities. The biggest challenge I have is when councillors contact me and say, "You know what, we've got some county lines going on." I say, "Okay, can you come and do some work with councillors to sort of raise, actually shine a light on this?" And you go and you chat and stuff. And fundamentally, the whole idea is, what's stopping you as adults having conversations with young people? What's stopping it? Why can't you go, "Yo, you're right. How you doing, guys? You all right?" Yeah. We don't.
I think that's just what you've just shared, Mark, is really fascinating. I'd like to pick up on a couple of things, if that's okay, particularly the last point. But it was interesting when you were talking about wisdom at the start of the conversation, is that you were saying it's not just the elders that have the right to wisdom. I think you're right. I think there's 2 types of wisdom as well. We have to have that understanding around wisdom. There's the environment that the youth are working in. They have their own generated wisdom based on the environment that they're working in. And the elders have their sort of wisdom based on knowledge experience. But what I want to pick up on, 2 things here, is one, the point you said about resilience. I think that's absolutely critical. What the elders do have because of their longer lived experience, is that thing about resilience. And what I'm seeing in the world at the moment, this is where, and I know with my own children, and partly, Ben, what you're seeing too as well with mental health issues, is that the gap is the resilience, isn't it? Right? It's that, how can we, in some ways, fast forward that resilience to the youth so that they can actually develop an experiment and not fear things, without without perceived consequences. Because as always, 9 times out of 10, and based on some of your history and what you've explained, is that the perceived consequences are always worse than the consequences themselves, right? And that's where we're generating fear. And I think the final point, Mark, which I'd like you to come back on, is, and you just, why aren't adults speaking to children, right? When you're having to go on the county line, speak to people and basically sort of educate them on that, there's a fear there. Just go out and do it. I think there's almost the Nike scenario here. Just go and do it, and don't fear it, right? And make it happen, right? And because things are never as bad as that's in my perceptions, is usually things are never as bad as people perceive them to be. And I do worry again about the fear we're creating with social media. We've touched on it before, with the banking system's going to collapse, right? Climate's going to have a huge negative impact, and all these other things that are happening, famine, war, you name it, all these things. And it's got to a point where people now are afraid to do anything, and we're in this sort of space of suspended animation. And by the way, it's not just the youth. I think the youth need it because they're the future, because they're going to get older, right? The old, yes, they need some support, but they're getting to the twilight, shall we say, of their lives, right? And they also need to get some of their fear away so they can enjoy the rest of their lives. But this is where, working together potentially, that we've got a possible solution. It just doesn't feel as though it's happening at the moment. No, Sorry, I've been rambling a bit there.
No. Ben, were you going to say something?
Yeah, well, I just wonder, because we and I do it as well. We blame social media for everything, but I think almost social media is an amplifier of things which are already in culture, already playing out. And I just wonder whether there was this, maybe from high profile, incidents in maybe the 80s or 90s, where parents just become less tolerant of letting their kids out to play, and we become more kind of suspicious of adults that might kind of work, or I don't know, just basically just assume. We started assuming the worst in other adults with our kids in mind, and so there was maybe this kind of overprotected, being slightly over suspicious of everyone, where kind of maybe why adults don't just go and deal with young people is maybe we've kind of built up this cultural stigma of just adults working with young people, and maybe there's this kind of like distrust, which we actually have to kind of break down. And Mark, you talk quite a lot about this deficit culture, and actually how do we kind of think more about starting from a place of empowerment. And maybe we have to just train our kind of like hundreds of thousands of years of psychology where we notice things which are wrong, and that actually allowed us to survive. But actually, if we just notice only what's wrong in other people and not actually what's right, and maybe they've got good intentions, maybe most people actually have good intentions, and actually can we train ourselves to see the good in each other more, that maybe that's a kind of gateway towards this kind of more kind of generational interaction becoming the norm, rather than you just pointing out the obvious. Why don't you just talk to each other?
It's true. All of that. We're in this world of catastrophizing everything, and it seems like we all buy into that, as it were, because I suppose there's a survival thing in there somewhere that, what if, we were mad into risk assessments where, we obviously that whole thing of stranger danger. played into all manner of safeguarding child protection issues, as it were, for those of us who worked in the voluntary sector, even though we know most abuse happens in your home. That's the mad thing as well. And I suppose somewhere down the line, there's another thing as well, which so many things come up, which we could chat for a long time about. But there's another thing, when people point finger, people love pointing fingers. There's always three fingers pointing back at yourself. And you think to yourself, until we as a people start to recognize that it's actually about what we put into ourselves. It's about how we educate ourselves. And that means the school has to adjust and adapt. That means we have to take risks there to actually recognize that we don't know the answers. But that's okay, isn't it? Always have this beautiful picture of dialogue, a beautiful picture of dialogue. And, it's a Greek word, dia and logis, and it means going through words. And I have this beautiful picture of a little wind blowing, and there's the words are going down a stream, and they're just floating and just dancing with each other as they go to the horizon. I don't even know what happens beyond the horizon as the words just dance with each other as they're blowing down the stream. That doesn't matter. It's the journey what's important. And I think we're so fixated with an outcome because there's a control element in that we actually don't care about the journeys that people go on, as it were. We know we have to have faith in people. That's why I said at the start, original sin. No, I believe in we're all born in the image of our gods, as it were. We're a conscious people, as it were. We need to be informed by those values and belief in each other, as it were, that we're brothers and we're sisters, as it were. And then maybe we can get to a place where, I mentioned this at the start as well, about sitting on that chair and listening, being respectful. I was taught through many brutal things, but what I was taught in that space is that there is respect. And we need to work with young people to build critical lens so they understand their responsibility. So if I'm talking, they're not talking. There's a time for them to talk. Of course, I might be talking a bag of shite and I might be rude or whatever. That's fine, because you've been built the tools to actually communicate effectively at appropriate times. But I think that we can't be thinking this is a laissez-faire type of kind of arrangement. The road to empowerment is a really disciplined journey. So what we're talking about is building a critical lens, which isn't kind of laissez-faire. No, this is about actually, you mentioned it in maybe the start, this notion of truth, the notion of truth. And I think we struggle around truth and feedback. We talk about strength-based this and that, as it were, but wider culturally, no, we don't really invest in that level of growth and that level of development. We don't really have that vision for what our community wants to look like. We don't even know what amenities we need in the community for it to thrive. We need to be starting to recognize that human beings are human beings, and we're in all of our stages of development, and we should all be looking at how we connect with each other through those stages of development. So we bring together a community, as it were. That's what surely we need. And I think that until we recognise, and this goes down to the commissioning process of stuff, that we invest everything in early help, everything actually in risk at that moment of extreme. We don't invest nothing in prevention. Nothing goes in prevention here. And we should be recognising and valuing actually the process of working with people in that space of prevention minimises the likelihood of people getting into crisis. That's the reality. But we don't. And society kind of mimics this whole catastrophizing everything. What's the next one, as it were? And we're like sheep. We just keep being, because we're scared. We don't have safe spaces to talk. So the COVID thing was an example. No one could say a word. No one could say, well, what about? No, don't even mention it. I'm into Ayurvedic medicine. I'm into all the therapeutic interventions. No. You just do as you're told and take the thing, mate. That's it. So you reduce people to no voice at all in that space because somebody knows what's better for us. Well, so I don't know about that.
So I think that's really interesting. You've provided a lot of context there and very valuable stuff, particularly about people being reduced and not going towards prevention. So I'm going to ask an open question, actually, for looking forward in terms of what we can do. And what triggered me to ask this question, apart from your, interesting insights, is an event that happened this week. And it reminded me of there's a famous Top Gear episode, in old Top Gear, with Jeremy Clarkson and Richard Hammond and James May. And, you know, there's always a bit of drama and theatre in what they do. But they got into this car, this Volvo, right? And they couldn't use the controls, the technology, right? So it was quite clearly designed by somebody in the youth with language and settings and structures that an old person would never get. They just get used to the twiddling the knobs to turn the radio on or the heater on and everything else. And it was quite funny and witty. And they go about setting to build a car for elderly people, right? You know, I think they had a Fiat Multipla and taking all the tech out and they're going strapping a high back chair and all this. And it was very witty and funny and very humorous for people of that generation who could understand it. But there was a very clear point to it, right? And that clear point was about, you know, about difference and about how that was somehow we need to meet in the middle to get things to serve, you know, both generations, both the youth and elder. And the reason I did that this week is, you may have heard in the news, there's a supermarket, a northern supermarket called Booths, because I used to live in Lancashire for a spell, and they've basically ripped out all their self-service tills this year now, and they're humanizing the process of that interaction with people, because a lot of the elders think they couldn't cope with this, they'd had enough, and they listened to feedback and they said, well, okay, no, we're going to put humans back on the tills, right?
Phone one disconnected.
So that they can, and again, that's a place, of course. I mean, if you look around some of the supermarkets, quite often you see people having a chat with the teller, right, as they're doing the food. So, you know, it felt to me like there was a rehumanization. But my question for you, Mark, is we've got these problems, these polarities, the challenges that you've described, which are absolutely real. What are the triggers going to be going forward, right? The trigger in this case was that obviously somebody had fed back, or you know, that those type of tools weren't working. But what are the future triggers? What are the triggers? What's going to make us, because you said we're acquiescing, right, to a position that is going to make people start talking to each other, right, from different generations, but also not just generationally, but start talking in general, getting away that catastrophic culture, the fear, so that we can start to sort of rehumanize, for want of a better word, and then help build the resilience in and get rid of some of that fear-based culture. What do you see as, where are the opportunities, where are the triggers, Mark?
I think the opportunities are quite difficult. I think that this is about action. I think that people have got to lead by example. I think people don't even know what we're really talking about. And they think, oh, what the hell are you on about? It's fine. Everything's good. Because young people have had no experience of this level of building capacity. They're not thinking critically. They're not actually coming up with any alternatives for the way in which they want to communicate, because they don't know what the alternative looks like. And adults, I think, we're so kind of like engrossed in our own sort of narcissistic journeys that we're not really stepping out of that space as well. And when I say narcissistic, I've been really rude, because we've got a lot of challenges going on. We've got to make livelihood. We've got to actually look at all the other stuff that we need to look at to actually maintain our own sort of like well-being and our own purpose, as it were. But I think it takes people to actually, and this is where maybe the finance don't even come into it. We just need a group of people who are prepared to demonstrate some impact by building these relationships, by actually saying, you know what, we want to actually look at mentoring some boys in our communities. How do we go about that in a safe way, as it were? And how can we actually create some joy in that space so people value and recognize it? Because we've got to try and people, by doing is what it's about. Like we said right at the start, there's a lot of talk, a lot of sound bites. We talk about inclusivity and stuff like that, but we know we're not that sort of diverse. So at the end of the day, we've got to go beyond the word, and we need to facilitate some sort of like mobility and movement of people connecting with each other. And that's going to be a challenge. But, you know, I think that as human beings, we're up for that. I think that we need to safeguard something going forward about the need to put people back in booths, as it were, because that's probably a fantastic starting point. But, you know, there'll be a lot of challenge in that space as well when it comes to economics and sort of other sort of pressures being leveled in that space. There'll be, you know, other changes. So I think that, I suppose all of this comes down to how involved are we as a people in decision-making structures? How involved are we in taking responsibility to ensure young people are enriched and young people are informed of their rights, and they're given a voice that they can actually use that voice because they've been informed appropriately in an anti-oppressive way about equality, about truth, about well-being, about democracy. about these things that school neglects to sort of like communicate with young people about. And we as adults, we've got to actually get together and we've got to make plans ourselves about how we connect with young people. Because there isn't a pathway. This is the challenge. There is no one who's doing it. We used to have community education, adult education. We used to have sort of educational providers in the evening, night school, people used to go to. We don't have that no more. So we've got to create that. That's about innovation. That's about actually care, you know, and it's whether or not we're going to respond to that and actually put those measures in place.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to try and do. But
it's kind of really interesting context to that question. And the thing which jumped out to me, Mark, was education. And you know, a lot of what happens, you know, a lot of our, you know, challenges in society are downstream from education.
Yeah.
So the kind of problems we've got are an output of our education system, which everybody goes through.
Yeah.
So you know, starting these kind of challenge, you know, starting to address these challenges from a young age is really important. And I think there's again, it's like another worst of both worlds, that we have an education system which forces young kids to grow up too quick. So rather than going out and playing and, you know, starting school a few years later, you know, increasingly kids are, you know, graded in primary school, you know, against their peers, and so they've got this kind of competitive, self-conscious, you know, kind of individualistic lens from a young age, rather than kind of, you know, socializing, playing, where you actually get to, you know, kind of experiment and learn about emotional intelligence, learn about actually what's right and wrong through kind of playing and experimenting. And so we kind of, you know, kids are growing up too fast. But then I think in some ways they then maybe stop growing, because actually then, you know, when you don't go through that's kind of that normal biological kind of growth, and actually it's this kind of artificial growth, I don't know, then we kind of basically protect kids in cotton wool, and so they become maybe, and this is a wild generalization, but actually you know, we kind of look for safety, and kind of, you know, rather than actually, you know, kind of young people having this, you know, kind of courage and aspiration. Actually, it's, you know, the first thing on, you know, a lot of people's mind is actually, you know, how can I be safe? Where actually kind of young people, you know, there should be an element of, you know, appropriate risk taking to kind of growing up and maturing, and, you know, developing your own pathway through life. And again, you know, it's a generalization. So, yeah, the kind of thing which I grapple with is where, you know, on the one hand, we have this urge to say, look, everything kind of like, let's get young people doing everything. But then it kind of feels like actually that's wrong, because actually there's a lot of things falling apart. And what we're doing is we're giving young people all of this stress to solve all of the kind of world's problems. You know, that seems wrong, but ultimately they're going to be the people that create the society of the future which they need to live in. So we actually do need to kind of support them. So by actually just completely giving them the reins and letting go and just say, look, you figure out yourself, is the wrong way. But actually, if we just do everything ourselves as adults, and say, look, this is your society, deal with it, is wrong. So I'm just trying to, as we move towards the end, I'm just trying to see what that kind of balance is. You know, how much autonomy do we give young people just to be young people by themselves without adult supervision? And actually, how do we also kind of be really intentional about actually mentoring, role modeling, kind of giving kind of wisdom, life experience at appropriate times for them to kind of channel that into something constructive as well?
I think your point there, sorry.
No, you go ahead, please, Mark.
I think your point there is true about the balance. There needs to be a balance that actually we need to model behaviors We need to lead by example in that space and create the conditions that young people can be part of. But again, when we say in dialogue, we're the adult in that space. So we need to take responsibility for that adult sort of culture, sitting on that chair again, sitting on that chair and understanding what roles we have. That doesn't mean saying we're disrespectful, ill-mannered. So I think there is a space that, and because again, we've got to remember, we said about conditions, there's a lot of competing priorities into the lives of young people. And I know you were saying about social media. Yeah, we don't want to go all over the place with that, but it is a big influence, as in other socializing factors are a big influence. So we've got a big challenge in this capitalist space to promote these ideas of peace, promote these ideas of cooperation, promote these ideas of fairness, challenge this idea of survival of the fittest. You know, we've got a lot to do to actually create something that is really credible, that the young people will actually draw something from it, which will inform their decision making going forward. Because the impact we'll have in those spaces is kind of minimal, but nevertheless, it's something that we need to strive towards. Because if we don't actually create those spaces, then there'll be nothing. There'll be no counter narrative. So the young people who just grow within the conditions that are set for them, and they're not even exploring anything apart from, like today, what's success? Well, it means money. So, and yet, you know, we'd all sit around and maybe challenge that.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, Mark. But I agree. I think what I found really interesting listening to Ben speak just before you was what you described, Ben, was a paradox, right? And that's, I see, as the problem at the moment. And the paradox is that, and we, you know, again, going back to your previous your points there, Mark, was about education, right? We need to educate people. But who's going to educate the educators, right? Because that's the thing. If you look at the systems we've got at the moment, right, it's the elders and the people in power. It's not necessarily even the elders now. It's probably the middle-aged people, you know, who are, you know, on the boards of schools and, you know, in school authorities and education departments determining what the youth will do. And maybe they're not the people that should be doing that. Because I asked about the triggers. What's going to be the trigger to make the change? Because when I look back to my scientific background, you know, and I look at physics, you know, a simple world, you get electrons flowing down a wire, right? Because you have a potential difference, right? There's a difference, you know, between one end and the other. So I'm questioning is, what's the trigger? Is it going to be a widening potential difference, right? Is it going to be a wider deficit, as you say, Mark, which is actually push things over the line? Or will we be able to see it earlier, be self-aware, recognize what's going on as responsible adults? I mean, you're absolutely right. I think the adults have to be responsible because they're the ones with the experience and the resilience. We can't rely on the kids to be responsible until they've learned how to be responsible. Because again, there's the paradox and there's the chicken and egg going on. So I think that's really important. And maybe, you know, in my experience, when I've looked at cultural transformation, is the trick is little and often. Right? If you want to make a sustainable change, you start doing it in recognizable baby steps, right? Because you get over that fear problem, right? Because people are doing it in small steps. And the point that you kept talking about there, Mark, was safety. I think Ben alluded to it as well. Almost it's too safe, right? Well, you know, for people to learn, we have to let the rope out a bit at a time, don't we? And verify that it's okay, right? You've done that now. There were no negative consequences. We'll let the rope out a bit more, and we'll let the rope out a bit more, and let the rope a bit more. And I'm thinking, you know, maybe in the education space, what we need is youthful people on the boards of school. We need younger people involved in the educational decisions, right? That's going to shape the other, not totally responsible, but working together, but bringing that other perspective into the education system so that we can start to nudge it along in the way that it needs to go, which will, I mean, ultimately it will serve everybody. To your point, Ben, is the youth is the future. If we get the youth right, then we're going to get it right for the older people as well, longer term. So I think it's really interesting. You know, do we let it fall off a cliff, or do we say, right, we're the responsible elders now? We see that, right? We're not going to let it fall off the cliff and have a huge potential difference. What we're going to do is we're going to actually do something a bit different, and we're going to get the kids, you know, and not just bring them on there just to be a bit of a voice and sit at the table, right? Let them do stuff as well. You know, if they're sitting on the, governance side of schools, maybe a bit radical, I don't know, but it's really got me thinking, Mark. Thank you for that.
No, I think that's very true. Representation is where it's at. But again, diversity, well, innovation comes from difference. So at the end of the day, we should be creating spaces for young people together, because what comes out of that is something quite dynamic. It's something quite different. We do have to reimagine. We have to reimagine, actually, even educators, in my opinion, that actually they might not be the best people to be in those places, because there's a lot of control in those spaces. I believe, as Ben knows, we're trying to look within our own communities and seeing those builders and those bricklayers and those other tradespeople, because I think there's a lot of skills and there's a lot of knowledge and strength that we as a community do not recognise, that we feel that we need to have professional standards in place in order to be an authentic voice. And in a way, I feel that there's there's something in me to think that I don't know if that is the authentic space. I think that then becomes a kind of an egotistical space. Actually, that gives me the right to have that voice, as it were. And I think we need to be more inclusive, and we need to actually recognise the lived experiences of so many more people, as it were, because that level of resilience and innovation and problem solving is something that I think a lot of organisations don't have, because they're constrained with policy, procedure, risk management processes that actually inhibit their ability to be kind of like authentic and to be relevant. I think we've lost personality. And I suppose going back to it, however much traumatizing those journeys were early in my life, that everything had a personality. And I think that we need to ensure that we strengthen the personalities and the culture and identities of the young people that we're working with. But we do need to create spaces that they can interact directly with older people. They're the wise people. They're the people who have got enormous amount of history and culture that the younger people can benefit from. Unfortunately, we don't seem to create those spaces that actually they can come together and innovate. That's what this is about as well.
Yeah, and I think if you go back to our hunter-gatherer days, culture in many ways, probably simplistically thinking about it, it started around the campfire. Sharing stories and sharing ideas about what we've seen, and those kind of those stories and ideas and knowledge turn into culture. And culture depends on the transmission of ideas, wisdom, experience, knowledge, whatever it is, being passed from one generation to the next. So, and culture underpins society, and so it's quite existential that actually we have this kind of functioning generational collaboration. Society just doesn't work without it. So it's kind of really important that we kind of get this right. And I think your point, John, and also Mark, you've got to start small. And yes. But actually there'll be small experiments all over the place, and those experiments then come together to form the underpinnings of something different. Changing the whole kind of system, whole of society just feels overwhelming. So we all have our kind of sphere of influence, what we can do, and so it's kind of empowering ourselves and each other to go on that journey and to take small steps, which is important. But I guess just one kind of final thought from me is there's something around kind of legitimacy, of teachers, of politicians, of business leaders. There's a kind of, I think what's going on maybe is this kind of question of legitimacy of do the people making the decisions, do they have kind of people's good interests in it at heart. And there's something about hierarchy, which you mentioned right at the beginning, Mark, because we seem to be kind of allergic, and we overcorrect. All hierarchy is bad. Let's tear it down. Let's make everything flat. And so there was some kind of good intentions. Maybe there was too much hierarchy, and there is still too much hierarchy if you think of all the kind of bureaucracy, massive bureaucracies. What's healthy hierarchy? look like in the spirit of these like different generations? And you I guess you've mentioned a little piece of it, but I think there's something which we need to get our heads around, which young people and old people can be on side with.
I suppose the hierarchy. I mean, again, we talk about, and then the word comes from me is ethical. You know, of course, I think you need to get things done. So that means you need to have systems and processes which enable that process to get things done. So I think hierarchy naturally sort of lends itself in them spaces because people have to get things done and decisions, and there's got to be some level of sort of accountability. And I think there's a way of that communication. There's got to be a way which is human-centered, person-centered sort of like ideas in that space, as it were. But equally, maybe other people would say, no, let's explore another way of doing things. I think our challenge is we haven't really kind of exhausted all of those areas to actually look at how we can work without that level of hierarchy. I think you need that level of hierarchy. I don't think there's anything wrong with having that hierarchy, but I think it should be facilitated in a way which is empowering, which actually has the person's in, you know, I mean, there's a big assumption in there when we're talking business about, you know, actual benefit, social value, and the individual for the shareholders' benefit. And that's another conversation about, you know, the ethics behind that level of sort of wealth, as it were. But, you know, there's a lot of things you say there, Ben, which require a lot of time.
You're right. They do.
Yeah.
And it's I mean, we're getting a good point to sort of close there, but I think it was a good point to finish on, Ben, particularly about hierarchy and legitimacy. And I was thinking about, as you were both talking, I think it's about having the appropriate level of hierarchy. I think, as you say, Mark, without any hierarchy, you're not going to have a driving force. And if it's totally flat structures, nothing's going to happen. Everybody's going to be stuck in suspended animation. So we do need a level of hierarchy, an ethical one. We need that responsible adult you know, thinking on concept. And I think, as you were talking about small steps as well, is I think we need a macro revolution, but we can't start with a revolution. It sounds as though we need, and you look at the history, what we need is evolution to get a revolution, right? You know, possibly in that order. And I guess before Ben sort of finally wraps up, just one reflection for me was sort of humorous. I saw a good post this week. I can't remember, it was on social media, but it was you may have seen this picture before, where two older people are running down the jetty naked, are holding hands, and they jump into the lake together, and they're called as seenagers rather than teenagers. And that really stuck with me, because that's the whole idea of the older people going through that life cycle where they've learned, they've grown up, they've educated themselves, they've paid back to society, their children, their family, put some structure in. But then later on in life, they've got the opportunity to sort of relive their youth again, right? Because they've been through all that lived experience, right? And they're now, you know, if they are financially secure, of course, in a situation, they can go on a life, you know, they can go and enjoy life a bit more and, you know, run down the jetty together naked and have a bit of fun. And I wonder if there's an opportunity there for the teenagers, the people who've got that level of energy and youth, etc., but all the experience to go and feed back into the system.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people would. I think a lot of people, I believe that there's a lot of families out there, a lot of parents out there, a lot of older people out there who would love the opportunity to contribute to the lives and development of young people. But we've kind of created sort of a cultural alienation in that space that doesn't seem to support those pathways. And I think we just need to sort of like maintain communication to say that we've got to create them ourselves. We can't wait for people to do these things because people are never going to prioritize. The same as I started this to say, you know, I always know about the boys and the men. I never prioritized it. So 15 years later, we're still in the same place. And there'll be loads of people saying, oh, yeah, you know, it's there, but we never prioritize. Somewhere down the line, we've got to prioritize these things. So if it's something that we want to do and support young people and older people, they call it intergenerational stuff, but we don't want it as a project. We want it as an ongoing sort of relationship and responsibility, because then I believe boys and young girls will get the support they need in order to make healthy decisions and bring their families up and keep the cycle moving as human beings, as it were, which is a space of beauty. You know, life is beautiful. You know, we give thanks for the grace that we have, but it would be nice for us to maintain a commitment in ensuring that all young people are given the opportunity to realize that grace. It would be nice,
Yeah.
but it's going to take a commitment. It's going to take an education. It's going to take a system-wide approach in order to sort of recognize the level of investment that's needed in adults, communities, professionals to actually enable that to happen. And recognize that they can't control all of that. They can't control that. You can never control a person, really and truly. You can condition them, but you can never control them, really. You know, we're humans.
Thank you. That's a great place to finish. Thanks for all your insights, Mark. Just it's so powerful, and hopefully when we get this out, this will be a thought provoker for a lot of other people, and maybe it will get maybe people to get engaged more and go and give their time and give their effort.
Yeah. Any final reflections, John, on sweet spots?
No, I think
what are you taking away?
No, I think we've covered that. I think we've, potentially, we've not solved the problem, but we've looked at the, bite-sized chunks, evolution for a revolution, getting people to take responsibility. So I think there's multiple sweet spots there, and I think they'll all coalesce to provide a bigger sweet spot. Yeah.
No, fantastic. Thoroughly enjoyable conversation, Mark. Thanks for your time. Thanks for sharing your history and your thoughts on where we go next. It's a big challenge, but as you say, it requires some commitment. And I think that there's interesting projects like blending primary school kids with people in care homes and actually mutually benefiting young people and old people in care. There's the kind of cliche that we help ourselves by helping others, and I think that there's no bigger opportunity, untapped opportunity, as you say, between the generations coming together to rebuild a lot of things which aren't working in society, and actually making them better for people who are aging and people who are young and emerging into the world. So I think that there's I don't know. I'm kind of, on the one hand, there's a huge kind of barrier and inertia to actually getting going, but actually I think that there's a huge opportunity in the long run for bringing different age groups together. So, fascinating conversation today. Thank you, John. Thank you again, Mark. Thanks for watching, and look out for an episode soon. Please follow us and share if you like. Take care. All the best, folks.
Take care.